Most people think an acquisition fails because the numbers were wrong. The numbers are almost never wrong. The integration is. The integration fails because it is very rarely treated like what it actually is, which is a change management engagement on a extremely compressed timeline with pretty much higher stakes than anything else that you can do as a leadership team. So the deal closes on a Friday, operations fires right back up on a Monday. And I had the fortunate ability, I could say that looking back on things now, I had the fortunate ability and experience to live through this multiple times. And there's nothing quite like it. If you've never been through an acquisition, whether that's because, whether that's like you're on the financial due diligence side, or in my case, I was on the ground floor operations side, kind of showing up and saying, hey, how's it going? I'm Dave, right? So nobody could quite prepare you for that until you have gone through it on your own. And obviously every deal kind of takes a different shape, right? There's a variety of, I'd say, dependencies or variables that shape what's happening. Like, for example, the last, acquisition that I was a part of, this was very much the scenario. I was at a celebratory signing dinner, toasting the deal. And literally on Monday, I was going to be showing up for reporting for duty with the rest of the team that was going to be getting notification of what had happened in a all hands meeting that the previous owner was going to be holding. And then I would be showing up about midday and taking over. And so, again, nobody can quite prepare you for what you're about to step into. You're walking into an organization that you know a lot about from a paper perspective, right? Like, you understand what they've reported out from a financials and what they've reported out from an inventory and from a, pure operations standpoint in terms of org structure and, key people and, so on and so forth. But things are totally different when you get there in person and, just getting your feet underneath you and understanding what's really happening, in the business. What are some of the biggest gaps that we need to solve immediately? And really what, I learned over having to kind of come in after the fact, right? Like taking over for somebody else, meaning some other leadership team, because that was often the case. There might have been some other folks across the leadership team, but generally I was coming in and taking over for, another plant manager, general manager, VP, whatever that particular title happened to be. And so, very quickly you're assessing, I'll go back to the last story I was just sharing. Very quickly, I was having to assess a multitude of things that, were now not just on paper, that we could ask questions about from a due diligence perspective and, kind of push to make maybe a better deal based on some risk or based on, something that just wasn't quite clear in the story or picture that was being presented. Right. So that was my, really kind of first foray into understanding we're solving for, this gap in real time to understand maybe what was, missed or not accurately represented. And again, not in a malicious way. It's just if you've never been through it and you're only maybe looking at the financial due diligence, you don't understand the opposite side of what actually happens, come Monday morning. All of the questions, all of the trying to get yourself up to speed on, again, all of the balls that every business has as they are operating, right? I tell this story about, it was actually happened to be at the same facility, right? But we had some pretty catastrophic equipment failures and during my tenure. And again, nobody can quite prepare you for the things that you ultimately encounter. And one of the things that was encountered during this catastrophic equipment failure is that orders didn't stop. Customers really didn't care that, we had a catastrophic equipment failure and we could not produce their orders, right? They still needed them. Their customers still needed them. So it's things like that where, on paper, it's one thing, which again, at the opening of the show, I was kind of talking about, financial due diligence kind of rarely misses the mark because there's a lot of opportunity to, hedge against risk, and you've got a lot of documentation typically that you're plowing through. But when that translates from, hey, deal done, we show up, now what? That's where the rubber meets the road. And so, the point is kind of just more broadly speaking is like, you're not just buying assets, right? Or a customer list, or, you're not just buying that, right? You're buying the culture. I mean, in most scenarios, right? Most acquisitions, you're buying the culture of this operating company. And what, again, through some experience, what I was able to see kind of firsthand through these acquisitions was that the acquiring facility needed to, we had to learn about that facility that was being acquired, and how their culture ran and the things that kind of they were used to, and then we had to help integrate them into the way that that we ran things. And so it was a really interesting time to be able to sit on the front, kind of front lines of that and help to navigate through some of those challenges. And again, I got the very fortunate experience to do that both firsthand when I was relocating to these facilities that were either acquired or, there was some other transition event that, I was taking over for. Or in some cases, I was able to do that from afar, where I was helping to, mentor the on-site leadership team, but again, to get them, integrated into the corporate culture that we had with all of these other, sister facilities and companies that did very, very similar things. And there's a lot of advantages and, perceived disadvantages and some real disadvantages, I would say, of that as well. So it again, from a pure culture perspective, it's like it wasn't a fit for everybody. And when you're going through this acquisition process, there's a lot of, I grew up in the print industry, right? So there's a lot of consolidation in that industry, especially with, now I worked for a mid-market sized business, but, I would say in the lower mid-market arena, there is privately held lower mid-market. There's a lot of M&A, mergers and acquisition activity. And so, this is going to be an ongoing kind of battle for the companies that are looking to grow through acquisition, which is why I thought this was such an important, talk to kind of go through and share, again, some of the stories that I've been fortunate enough to experience. And again, I would probably during the time never tell you I was fortunate enough to experience it because, a lot of it was just sheer chaos and living through the day to day of, getting up to speed, kind of understanding all of the things that the company that we acquired or that I was coming into was doing really well. Because inevitably there were some really great things that were happening. And there was also, a gap in terms of how this company is operating because it's been independently operating. And now how that operating company from a culture perspective fits into like this bigger picture in my case of the company that I worked for, which, at the time had 50 plus facilities and, 30 some odd brand names that they operated on. This was a sizable company that, these businesses that were being acquired were coming into. And, on the opposite side, because of some of the mentoring that I was doing, I got the firsthand view or the sneak peek of, some of the anxiety that that folks were experiencing, not knowing if their job was at risk, not knowing if, they were going to be asked to relocate, not knowing if, boy, we have this other facility that does like literally the exact same thing as us, will we be consolidated into them, right? Ultimately, like, hey, what about me, right? Always answering that question. So that's a lot of the stuff that happens, believe it or not, like the first 24 hours, right? It is a literal whirlwind. And if you are a acquiring company and you have not necessarily thought through what the timeline from signing the deal and closing to who shows up, how do we support, how do we integrate, right? Both culture and systems. That's again a whole nother layer I haven't even mentioned yet. But how do we do that stuff? How do we help support? How is this, acquisition going to actually help us grow our business? Is our plan to let them operate independently? Is this a complementary, acquisition where we can, maybe cross sell and is complementary from that perspective to our customer base, to their customer base? That's why, honestly, it's one of the, as I say, it's kind of equal parts excitement and, challenge all unfolding in real time. And a lot of people that are in this space, that are doing deals regularly, they're more focused on the financial and due diligence side of things than they are on the operation side. So it's kind of, in a lot of cases, there's this handoff. It's, again, it's, equal parts, I would say, of excitement and, and challenge that we get into. So just some more specifics that, that I would say I've seen kind of firsthand. But one of the biggest things when it comes to like this culture element and especially in the scenario that I kind of lived through many times, which was, hey, we acquired this business that is very similar to this other business that we already have that's, operating. Right. And in some cases, it was like right down the road. There was one facility that, that I was at that we had our sister facilities. We had 3 of them. I think there was a total of 3 of them. I would say within, 30 miles of each other. Right. So it's very easy to think like, oh my gosh, what about me? Right. Or the kind of more typical, like the us versus them, right? How do you sort through some of that? How do you talk about, integrating this, acquired facility into, what is already happening, and whether that's a one, facility operation or, a size of a company that I worked in where you've got, tens, right? Tens of operating facilities that you're ultimately trying to fold into. And, I'd say like some of the stuff that I would say typically doesn't work. And again, it's all dependent on the variables of, the deal and kind of what is happening on the kind of on the ground floor, from a pure culture perspective, how and systems perspective, like in the acquired business and in the acquiring business, right? Like how mature are the systems in the acquiring business? Is this, are they still figuring out kind of their culture, their systemization? And so now you've got, in some cases, 2 or 3 of these simultaneous tracks that are happening where you've got the acquiring business that is, figuring out how to grow and mature and improve and optimize and, all the things. And then you now have added the complexity of this other company that is doing the same types of things. So I would say that's another thing that I've seen, not so much in the company that I spent nearly 2 decades with, right? But in other kind of client conversations, general conversations that I have with folks, across the space that are thinking about getting into it, right? Again, they're like all things, there's a lot of complexity built into these types of relationships, these types of growth models. So it can be very easy to think, we just got to buy our competitor down the road, and we can grow market share. It's not that simple, right? Or I should say it is that simple. It's certainly not easy, though. There's a lot of complexity, especially as you start to actually dive into, what's happening from a day-to-day perspective. Another aspect that I would, touch on with this, and again, it really, kind of goes back deeper onto the systemization side. But you have to understand like how mature is this business that's being acquired from a pure systemization perspective, right? Because if you're an acquiring company that is very systems mature, and you either don't have an appetite for helping a company go through that transition again, or there's some integration challenges potentially. You have to have all of that stuff on the roadmap. So again, I go back to when I was a part of the acquisitions or coming into a scenario like that, we had a very clear roadmap of the activities that would get moved over and kind of consolidated from a pure systems perspective, right? And then as time went on, we started to talk more about, what's the planning cycle like, and how do we think through, process improvement, and, all of the different aspects of, operating that business. And again, that is more than likely going to be significantly different than how you are operating and executing at the acquiring facility or business, right? So again, it goes way beyond just taking a look at the tech stack and saying, hey, we have a HubSpot implementation over here. We have a HubSpot implementation over here. We could probably just consolidate those, and some of those things do get even put into the deal from a return on investment perspective. But again, I've got, just some horror stories of those types of thought processes that just don't play out when you kind of land there on Monday and you start to see what's actually happening in that existing operating business. So again, it's just something to be mindful of as these things kind of start to unfold. So I'd say the thing that ultimately you're trying to bake into this, and then as time goes on, it obviously continues to smooth out. But it's like there can be a lot of pressure to find some quick wins or build momentum in that first 90 days. But the reality of it is that it's back to the crawl, walk, run, right? The reality of it is, depending on how things are operating in that acquired company, there could be a lot of groundwork to cover just to get somebody up to speed. Right now, again, it's going to be different if you're not dropping somebody, like myself, into the mix brand new that has no idea what's happening in this company, versus, taking on the leadership team that's already there. Same thing. There's a whole level of complexity to that, right? There is no right or wrong answer with this. That is why, talking through some of these things, if you are, interested in growth through acquisition, or if you've maybe done a deal that didn't pan out necessarily the way that you anticipated, I'd venture a guess that it is, kind of one of the things, due to one of the reasons that, ultimately I'm kind of starting to, to unpack all of this stuff. So all that to say, right, everybody gets, hey, we need to see some progress. We need to get a handle on what's happening. We want to see, some integration, some cost savings. We want to see some efficiency or effectiveness gains. But the reality of it is, like, an operating business has its own set of gaps and challenges. And you have to, when you're on the ground floor from a pure operations perspective, you have to figure out how to prioritize those two things, because they really are competing sets of priorities. You have, the acquiring company that has its own set of priorities based on a variety of things, right? And then you have the acquired company that already had their, priorities and kind of, gap, assessments established, right? So that all has been disrupted. And, all of that to really just say, like, hey, I think we have to kind of give, folks some grace in terms of, understanding there's two sides to this coin, and the kind of closer we can come together in terms of, helping each other understand what the prioritization is, and also setting up, both this shared lens of, culture integration, breaking down those walls of the us versus them, building in those support elements. And then again, that systems maturity lens. Those are the things that, make this stuff go a bit smoother. Those are the things that, I would say lead to a faster, return on investment or growth within that acquired business, or maybe some cost savings or consolidation, from an expense standpoint, across the landscape. So, where does all of this start, right? Like I talked a little bit about the. I'm always trying to bring it back to this simple thought of like, great, what happens tomorrow? Like what happens on Monday? And because again, it can be really, really easy to kind of get into the weeds, or to leave this thing so high level. But it is just this idea of, the crawl, walk, run, the cycle of improvement, whatever framework you want to apply for that. And just this general idea that I talk about around creating clarity, consistency, and accountability. And that certainly applies from a pure culture perspective. It certainly applies from a systemization or, optimization lens, as well. So, that's the stuff that it takes to make these things, transactions successful. And at the end of the day, right, in most cases, you're not necessarily full on merging two companies, right? You're building a kind of a systemization and culture initiative across facilities. And that is not just challenging, but also takes time to be able to execute effectively. And at the end of the day, if we continue to, increase our effectiveness of delivering value to our now collective customers from a individual perspective, individual operating unit or facility perspective, things are heading in the right direction, right? And so I would encourage you to continue to, keep the lines of communication open, look for opportunities to support, and always trying to drive back to that, kind of foundational element of creating clarity, being consistent across those operating units, facilities, divisions, what have you. And, ultimately the accountability piece will take care of itself. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment. Feel free to reach out to me via the website or any of the other social channels. I love talking about this stuff. I've got, a tremendous amount of kind of lens of experience when it comes to a variety of things, both acquisition related and operations, operational excellence, and systemization or optimization. So happy to have a conversation, see how I might have some resources or even just some stories that may give you a bit of a different perspective. So thanks so much, and I'll catch you next time.